Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, and all the better for spending some quality time with you because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential drink. I love hearing what you all drink because it's fascinating. It just amazes me how many drinks are out there. You wouldn't really believe that was possible. Anyway, before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I shuddered with revulsion as I stared at the bleak grey, dreary concrete building, discerning the oppressive, hostile, unfriendly energy it conveyed. If this monochromatic, prosaic building was a person, he would be a cantankerous, bolshy character that despised everybody and spat at random strangers on the sidewalk, swearing at them belligerently with demeaning, cruel and cutting words. He would be someone you would intentionally avoid, if you saw him on the street, that is, and you would quickly scurry to the opposite side of the road, pretending not to have seen him at all. He would wear grey, bedraggled clothes and smell so rank and odious you would give him a wide girth. Even the Good Samaritan would have a hesitancy approaching the solitary, friendless stranger, for no one wanted to be acquainted with him, for very good reason. If you haven't guessed yet, I was standing outside the ugly, sterile and colourless facade of the greyest, most depressing women's prison that I'd ever beheld. Even looking at it sent shudders down my spine and caused my heart to almost miss a beat. If you saw him on the street, that is, and you would quickly scurry to the opposite side of the road, pretending not to have seen him at all. He would wear grey, bedraggled clothes and smell so rank and odious you would give him a wide girth. Even the Good Samaritan would have a hesitancy approaching the solitary, friendless stranger, for no one wanted to be acquainted with him, for very good reason. If you haven't guessed yet, I was standing outside the ugly, sterile and colourless facade of the greyest, most depressing women's prison that I'd ever beheld. Even looking at it sent shudders down my spine and caused my heart to almost miss a beat. It was exceedingly difficult and imperious to even comprehend that behind these cold, austere and heartless walls were prisoners or inmates who would remain within them until their hearts beat their very last. And alas, my mother was now one of those incarcerated, unfortunate people relegated to life imprisonment for murder. How had it come to this, I'd pondered. Only a few months ago we were living such a blissful country life in Wyoming, and we knew everyone in this unpopulated part of the world, with blissful memories of watching the exquisite golden orange sunsets melt over the horizon in a myriad of resplendent colours before dusk. It was a place that was blissfully quiet and serene, and in my opinion quite magnificent. Our friends either fished for trout on the lakes or drove long-haul trucks for a living, worked in coal mines, or were even cowboys or ranchers. I simply adored the outer-worldly, surreal feeling of Wyoming, with the vast desolateness of the plains, the sagebrush, the ranches, the rugged mountainous expanses, the crisp fresh air, not to mention the endless azure blue sky, and acres of curvaceous highway that would go on for ever and ever, without ever seeing a solitary soul in sight. You could literally have 4 seasons in one day in this part of the world, from sleet to rain, hail, and then perfect sunshine, and the summers here could be real scorchers. It was a norm to see deer scampering across the open plains every single day, along with other indigenous wildlife and phenomenal bird species. Wyoming is the kind of place of which you will need to return again and again, for once you have tasted the open vastness of the glorious plains, you will be drawn back to this awe-inspiring part of the world again and again and again. Life had been so good for us here, and a chance to lay down roots for us, to make lifelong friends. But my mother had ruined it for the both of us by her impetuous actions one dreadful night. I still remember it with a crystal-clear clarity, and it is indelibly marked on my mind forever, never to be erased. I so wish with all my heart that I could wind the clock back and undo all the damage, but it's too late for that now, and all that is left are the shattered dreams, tears and lost hopes, the remnants of what could have once been. My mother Melissa was a passionate woman, and on reflection I think her passion was her biggest downfall in life, a crippling impediment that robbed her of being grounded or pragmatic, so much so that it was her passion that incubated in her an incessant anger and grudging covetousness in her heart that finally hatched out into a monstrous chicklet of which even she failed to recognise, when it lost leave of its senses one dusky dark night, when the pendulum of fate swang in the no direction, and life, well, it was never the same again. The seed that ultimately led to all the impending chaos and upheaval all started one extraordinary beautiful spring morning in Wyoming. I was eating a bowl of cornflakes when the phone rang. My mother answered it with her bright, chirpy voice, and then the colour drained from her face, which took on a distinctive ashen pale colour, and she became green at the gills. She began to tremble violently. "Are you absolutely sure, Melanie?" she asked. You know this to be true, do you? You haven't got it wrong. Who is she, then? When did you hear about this? Did you say that she was pretty?" Thank you very much, Melanie. Thanks for letting me know." My mother slammed down the phone violently, looking at me with fierce blue fiery eyes, and she ground her teeth together angrily, while her nostrils flared, and frankly she looked as hostile as a pit bull terrier, in an aggressive stance, that is, and even I became scared of her threatening demeanour. "Tim cheated on me," she said. "He bloody cheated on me, the bastard! Wait until he comes home. I'll kill him. I'll wring his neck. I'll never, never forgive him for this. Never, never," she said, throwing her coffee mug against the wall and shattering it violently into pieces so that the coffee dribbled down the wall ominously, like brown blood, and her mug had shattered into hundreds of pieces, a horrifying prelude of the horrors that ultimately were to come. I knew my mother's propensity to always overreact, so I had to try and calm her down, but that was rather like trying to tame an elephant that's in musk. It wasn't going to happen. "Melanie may have got her wires crossed, Mum," I assured her. "I'm sure Tim wouldn't do that to you. He's such a decent, honourable man. He would never, ever deliberately set out to hurt you, Mum. Even if it is true, Mum, it must have just been a once-off random thing, an accident. Possibly he just got drunk. It does happen. He's a long-haul truck driver. It can get very lonely on the roads for hours at a time. Try and put yourself in his shoes for a moment. Look at things from his perspective." "A random accident," said my mother. "You think having a romp in the hay with another woman is a random accident? What are you smoking, dear? Tim knew exactly what he was doing. He's as guilty as hell. Melanie told me she overheard him telling her husband Weston about the guilty, adulterous affair he was having behind my back. How bad he actually felt for cheating on me. 'I think I want to be sick,' she screamed. 'Who the hell does he think he is? Some kind of Casanova that melts women's hearts like chocolate? Oh, in his dreams.' 'What did Melanie hear Weston say?' I asked. 'He told Weston that he liked the other woman better than me, because she was calmer and more easygoing. He had the brazen audacity to say that I was impulsive, flighty, very, very intense, high maintenance and emotionally exhausting. Can you believe the bloody cheek of it all?' 'Well, it is kind of true, Mum,' I said. 'You aren't exactly everybody's cup of tea. You do tend to get very overreactive about things, and you often don't think before you act. Well, you're exceedingly intense, which can be very draining.' 'How dare you!' screamed my mother. 'How dare you talk to your own mother like this? You go to your room right now. Forget about lunch and dinner, because you ain't going to get any. Get it?' I nodded dutifully, obediently returning to my bedroom. There was no point in reasoning with my mother, not when she was so frenzied like this. I knew eventually she had calmed down, but she was so hot-headed, unbridled and impulsive, like a tempestuous sea. 1 minute calm and serene, the next minute either her anger or excitement would escalate like a colossal incoming wave, crashing towards the shoreline and hurling down anything in its wake with a mighty, powerful force. Yes, that was my mother. Tim and I were on the disadvantaged receiving end of her up-and-down seesaw-like moods that would blow hot and cold like a hairdresser's hairdryer, and were intensely dramatic. I seriously used to think that my mother's explosive outbursts made daytime television look exceedingly dull. If the television producers wanted a bird's-eye view of a real angry rage, they only needed to watch my mother in action, and then they would see how deficient their television drama actually was. I knew why Tim would describe my mother as exhausting, because I hate to say this, but she really was. I could almost understand his adulterous affair with a quite grounded woman who did not give him the hard time my mother did. I got it, I really did. I secretly empathised with him, and knew that when he returned home from his long-haul truck-driving stint, he would be at the receiving end of my mother's wrath. I truly felt sorry for him. I ascertained that their reunion was going to be potentially combustible. They would fight like cats and dogs, and my volatile mother would invariably scream, explode, and throw plates around the house like at a Greek wedding. In the morning you would find the carpets would become like a minefield of broken crockery. My mother was a very jealous, umbrageous woman, always threatened by any woman who might possibly be prettier than her. I remember she was absolutely obsessed with her physical appearance, and of course her weight, that she literally watched like a hawk, far too terrified even to put an inch on, to the point that it became ridiculous. Then there were hours that she would spend at the hair salon, having her long blonde hair blow-dried to perfection, and her long nails turned into glittering works of art. She would spend Tim's hard-earned money on designer additions to her wardrobe, from handbags to fancy shoes. I always thought my mother was hardwired to be a city girl. She didn't possess the quintessential country girl attributes, as laid-back and easy-going were not part of her biological makeup. I could hear my mother throwing our china all over the house, breaking it into thousands of pieces, screaming at the top of her lungs, "I hate you, Tim McKinney! I hate you!" Tim McKinney had been like a father to me, and I loved him dearly, as he was the only father I ever had. I was the fortuitous product of my mother's former promiscuous youthful days, when she was living in Atlanta as a young, carefree, irresponsible woman who had been through more fleeting relationships than you and I have had hot dinners. It stands to reason that she had absolutely no idea who my real father was, and so I never ever bothered to ask. I already knew the answer to that question. "Sorry, sweetheart," she would have invariably said. "I really don't know." When she became pregnant with me, she was planning to visit an abortion clinic to eliminate the begrudging responsibility that was regretfully growing in her womb, that would invariably hold her back from her happy-go-lucky lifestyle. But Tim, a young man at the time she'd been dating for a while, persuaded her to reconsider keeping the baby growing in her womb, as he was exceedingly adverse to the brutality of abortion. And thanks to him. "Come and live in Wyoming with me," he said, "and I'll take care of you and your baby. We can live together as a happy family, and maybe one day tie the knot." But the latter never ever happened. If it was not for the generous kindness of Tim McKinney, it is most unlikely that I would have ever been born. For as long as I can remember, Tim had been a long-haul truck driver, travelling over vast distances, delivering freight, and the three of us had become like a happy family, and I loved and adored him because he was like a great big teddy bear, lovable, cuddly, and so charming. On the night that Tim returned home, as he was taking a few days off trucking to spend with us, I was confounded to see my overwrought mother was actually behaving herself and treating Tim very sweetly. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, as I thought my mother had inexplicably calmed down, and I optimistically assumed that she would let sleeping dogs lie. We enjoyed a very pleasant dinner together, and then all hell broke loose in the middle of the night. I woke up to hear my mother screaming at Tim. "I'm not intense," she screamed. "How dare you say that about me?" "You are intense, Cindy," I could hear Tim saying. "Very intense.
and it's overbearing at times. I just wish you would learn to relax. Yes, I am very sorry for what I did. It never meant anything. I got completely drunk. I do love you, and nothing will ever change that. You mean the world to me. How could you cheat on me, you bastard? I could hear her scream. I don't remember what ugly words were articulated or expressed between them, but there were many. The yelling seemed to go on forever. I refused to listen. I eventually just covered my ears to block out the incessant arguing that droned on and on. They truly were like a pair of barking dogs. Finally the house became very quiet and tranquil, and everybody retired to bed, and only then did I slip off into a peaceful sleep, ever thankful that the peace in our house had resumed. But not for long. A few hours later I was awoken to this very strange thumping, squishy, cutting sound that was repetitive. I was sure I'd heard Tim scream, "Stop, Cindy! Please stop! Don't! Please don't! Please, Cindy!" My blood went as cold as ice. My heart leapt into my throat, and a nasty bitterness swept into my mouth like a windstorm over the desert. Something was seriously wrong, and in my gut I knew that Tim was in dreadful trouble. I leapt out of bed, racing towards my mother's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, very, very slowly, and it creaked. I was very afraid of what I would see. There she was, straddled over Tim's motionless body, my mother, with a knife in her hands, just slashing his torso over and over again in a savage frenzy. The bed was a sea of crimson, and the sides of the walls were spattered with blood, while my mother's pale face and her pyjamas were bespeckled with red droplets. She looked like a woman deranged and possessed, and her eyes rolled back in her sockets to expose the whites, like a zombie. "Stop, Mum!" I screamed. "Stop! Stop what you're doing! Please, stop! What are you doing?" I said, shaking her viciously. "What the heck are you doing?" I said, finally grabbing the knife from her hands, and meeting no resistance, as the wet knife, covered in blood, just slipped into mine. I was devastated as I stared at the man that I'd loved as a father, so savagely killed in such a despicable, godless and cruel way. For a moment my mother sat there vacantly, as if she wasn't even present in her own body, and then she gasped, staring in horror at her wet, blood-soaked hands. It was as if she had slipped out of a trance and realized what she had done. She was mortified. Tears poured down her eyes at the distressing sight of Tim's body, that was now barely recognizable. It was so slashed up. Then she began to scream and scream and scream and scream. "Oh, my God! What have I done? What have I done? Look what I've done!" My mother was described by the judge as a vindictive, evil, narcissistic woman who deserved to rot away in a prison cell and never to see the light of day again. So back to the present. I loathed coming here. I hated and despised my visits to this prison, but I couldn't abandon my mother. She was all I had left in the entire world. I was grieving the loss of our idyllic lifestyle in Wyoming that was long since behind me now. And I missed Tim so dreadfully much, and I even missed my mother. It was very difficult to forgive her for what she'd done to Tim, but I knew I couldn't live with bitterness and hatred in my heart that would eat at me like a cancer, despite the fact that my life had also been turned upside down. I was now living in an apartment in Atlanta, working as a restaurant manager to keep the roof over my head. I'd visited my mother several times in prison, and seeing her in her blue and white scrubs with a bright smile on her face had been very hard to stomach. How could I have done such a heinous, evil thing, she had said to me. Tim was the best thing that happened to me, but I destroyed everything. I told my mother to seek forgiveness from God and to pray that she would learn to keep her emotions in check and to stop overreacting, because that had always been her biggest problem. Today, on my mother's request, I was actually visiting another prisoner who was her cellmate, a woman who'd killed 2 people in an armed robbery, and had thus been estranged from her family, who never wanted anything to do with her again. The poor woman had not had a visitor for over 10 years. The only reason I'd actually agreed to visit her is that my mother knew that I'd always been passionate about the subject of Bigfoot, and this woman had one hell of a story to tell me about the hairy man that I wanted to hear. I've never heard a story like it, my mother told me, but you need to hear it from the horse's mouth. It's not made up. Sherry may be many things, but a liar she most certainly is not. I waited in the visitor's room, feeling rather uneasy, with a large lump developing at the back of my throat, and a slight increase in the thumping of my heart, which was expected, I suppose. There was a level of angst and trepidation as I waited for her to emerge, the prisoner, I mean. What had I got myself into, I thought? I certainly wasn't in the practice of meeting hardened criminals, especially murderers, for a cheerful nonchalant tete-a-tete. Ah, there she was, ambling towards me with a jubilant skip to her step. She looked very laddish and masculine in her blue scrubs. She had a shaved head and a few dark hedgehog prickles merging through the scalp. Her skin was fair, with hazel eyes, along with a rather petite pierced nose. I could see that her large, tomboyish, muscular but well-upholstered body was completely covered in inky tattoos. I shuddered as she beamed at me with a mannish smile, bounding towards a visitor's chair, her pillowy breast jiggling as she grabbed it, dragging it across the ground, and finally sitting down with an almighty thud. "Hello," she said. "I'm Sherry. Everybody calls me Bulldog around here. My bark is a lot worse than my bite, you see," she joked. "I've been sharing a cell with your mother. You do know what I'm in for, don't you?" I nodded. "Armed robbery and murder," I said. "You're not scared of me, are you?" she asked. "Because I'm not the same person I was back then. I have found Jesus." Is that not what they always said, I thought secretly to myself. Maybe it was a ruse to disarm people. "Good," I said. "I'm very glad about that. I'm so happy you've come. You're my first visitor for 10 whole years. It means an awful lot. Thank you for coming." "It's a pleasure," I said, "but you do know why I'm here." Sherry grinned. "Bigfoot, the hairy man." My face lit up. "My mother says you've got quite a story. Will you tell me everything? I'm a huge Bigfoot fan. I watch absolutely everything on television that I can get my hands on. I really love the creature." "Of course," said Sherry. "I'll tell you absolutely everything." "Well," she began, "I grew up in Georgia in a very dysfunctional family. My abusive father tirelessly beat up my mother day in and day out, and perpetually blew up into drunken rages and regularly screamed at us, blaming us for his miserable life. Our property bordered this really stunning, gorgeous wood grove where we would camp all the time. I don't even think my parents realised we were away from the house because they were so disinterested and detached from their very own children, seemingly caught up in their contentious issues and troubles, that they were too self-absorbed to even consider their own children. We were expected to help ourselves to food from the fridge whenever we were hungry and to do our homework without any kind of parental supervision. And this lack of guidance in our lives really made us feel spurned, as if we were surplus to requirements. One night as we were camping in the woodgrove, I heard a very strange sound. It sounded like two people engaged in a conversation. I was a little concerned, as I was the oldest sibling and very protective of my brother Cody. After all, there was no one else to look out for him. I thought a couple of men were out coon hunting in the woods, and that was putting us in potential danger because we were out there camping. So I crept closely towards the voices and hid behind a sizable oak tree to discern what was actually going on. I remember thinking it was very strange to see a couple of bears talking in a foreign language together, as from the rear view they looked uncannily like bears covered in dark hair, standing up on their hind haunches, perfectly straight, talking together like human beings would, in a foreign language. I stared at the bears in astonishment until one of them turned around, and that was when I realised that this was not a bear. But what was it? I was so fascinated that I forgot to be even remotely afraid. I stared in awe at these things with eyes as wide as large saucers, and my jaw hanging to the ground in astonishment. These were people, I thought, wild people, covered in hair, with heads that possessed a pointed tip, and very long arms that fell beyond the knees. They were lean and lanky, with large, powerful shoulders and very dense, tight muscles. They must have stood at about 6 foot tall and 500 pounds. I noticed they were both female, as both creatures had floppy breasts, and they spoke in feminine voices, in a language I am not acquainted with, but the talking was non-stop, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards the whole time. It was like that. They were completely wrapped up and engaged in a conversation, and I sensed they were almost arguing, but not quite. It was more polite than arguing, but discussing something very intently. All of a sudden, would you believe it, I gave the game away. I sneezed. The two wild women, on hearing my sneeze, looked at each other in bewilderment. They became as still as statues, their eyes darting around the woodgrove very cautiously, like night vision cameras, and then both eyes were fixed on the oak tree, where I was hiding. They knew exactly where I was. One female pointed at the tree, and I remember thinking in that moment, I'm a goner. Suddenly I was overcome with dreadful trepidation. My knees began to wobble, and I could hear the creatures darting towards me at lightning speed, crunching the leaf litter beneath their sizable feet. I wanted to run away, I really did, but I couldn't. I was frozen. My muscles restrained by my own terror. I started to shake and wobble like a jelly, as two deep-set pairs of eyes regarded me very curiously. But funny enough, they didn't appear to possess any hint of animosity or aggression, which came as a huge relief to me. One of the wild women began to natter away happily to the other one, who didn't look too convinced by what she was saying, but finally appeared to relent. To my amazement and bewilderment, the excited young Bigfoot handed me a package wrapped up in a deerskin, and then she fixed her eyes on me with a very intense stare, almost as if she was looking right through me. It was a rather peculiar feeling, like you're being scanned at the hospital. I didn't look away, but completely met her gaze. I don't know whether this was telepathic communication or not, but I swear I could hear words. Look after him. I'll be back. Had I imagined those words, I wondered, but I briefly glanced down at the tiny bundle that was in my hands, and I realized I was carrying a baby boy that was covered in a slight scattering of hair. It was gurgling and smiling at me, like a happy human baby, and was terribly cute. Only this was the wild woman's infant. By this time, the two female wild women had run off together very happily. I got the impression they asked me to babysit their baby, and I was astonished that they were willing to trust me with such a responsibility. I returned to my tent, and Cody was astonished to see this little baby in a deerskin wrapped up in my arms. He would never have believed my story in a million years if he hadn't seen the hairy baby for himself. The baby was terribly sweet and exceedingly intelligent for one so young. In truth, I've never seen such an interactive baby before. He was even pulling my ponytail and studying us with the cutest eyes that I've ever seen. He never cried once. A while later, the wild woman returned to our tent. She put her head through the door very boldly, without any evasiveness at all, and handed me a leg from a deer. I think it was a gift, while I returned her baby to her. I ventured out of my tent to watch the wild woman. One wild woman had a deer minus its leg wrapped over her shoulders, and I watched the two of them glide away in the forest, but I never saw them again. I gasped, "Do you mean to say you babysitted a Bigfoot baby?" Sherry nodded. It certainly was a big deal for me to be trusted by an adult, even if it was only a Bigfoot mother. No one has ever trusted me with anything before that, but she did. That meant a huge amount to me. "Why do you think she wanted you to babysit her youngling?" I asked. "I think she was young, just like a teenager. She wanted to have fun, and I imagine she wanted to go hunting with her sister or friend, and I appeared to be at the right place at the right time, and she saw me as the solution to her problem." "Perhaps she'd seen you before in the woodgrove and become accustomed to you," I suggested. "That's what I thought," said Sherry. "You know, over the years our tent had almost become a fixture and fitting in the woods. There were times we felt as if we were being watched. Maybe it was the Bigfoots, and she had become familiar with us after watching us for some time, and possibly felt she could trust us. When she saw me, she didn't look at me as if to say, 'Who the heck are you?' It was like she already knew me. It really was rather weird. Well, they do say that Bigfoots can read energy. Maybe she read yours and just knew she could trust you. Can I ask you another question, Sherry? Did the Bigfoot smell offensive at all? You often hear that they do on television. No, said Sherry. They didn't smell offensive at all. On the contrary, I didn't smell anything. 10 years have passed since I first learnt about this incredulous Bigfoot story, and now I'm a happily married woman myself, living in the Georgia countryside, but I do visit Wyoming whenever I get a chance, and hope to retire there one day. I regularly visit my mother and Sherry, both in prison, because I truly appreciate that incarcerated people need some connection with the outside world, and despite everything, I love my mother and very much care about Sherry. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, that was an incredible tear-jerking story. Really tugged at the heartstrings. Anyway, if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And until next time, goodbye and good night.